Welcome back to another episode of a podcast written by a software engineer. I'm your host, Perry, and today we're actually talking to a really sick guest. We got Mark on the show. Mark, how are you?
Good. Hi, Perry.
There we go. It's always good to have some energy at this start, just because a lot of stuff we talk about is really technical at the end of the day, and people just assume that technical is really boring, which debatably it is at the end of the day, but there's actually so many things to talk about, especially considering you have loads of experience and history in the industry to begin with. But the cool thing is, for the people who don't know Mark Snyder yet, actually, can you give us a brief description of what you're doing nowadays and who is Mark Snyder?
Sure. I've been developing software for about 20 years now. I started out like everybody else, just kind of going through the learning process. And I really, I think I've got a little bit of an interesting perspective because my background isn't solely in product. I've worked for some different types of companies, and I've also done some independent contracting. So I guess I'd start with, who I am. I'm a father. I've got three young boys at home, which I'm super excited to play Minecraft with and just watch them grow. And they take up a lot of my passion and my time, and I'm really excited to have them. So that's kind of part of my life. But the other part of my life has always been technology. I grew up, from a very early age, being interested in technology. My father gave me a Commodore 64 when I was pretty young, which also shows how old I am. But I was able to kind of learn how to program and do certain things on that computer. And I knew from a very early age that I just loved technology. And I think part of the reason I loved it was you get the ability to express your creativity, but you get to share that and create things that other people can experience. And I looked at things like video games and software products and things like that. And all of those produce an experience and hopefully some value for people. And I really liked doing that. I liked writing code, knowing that somebody would be leveraging, the product from that. So my background is, I've worked for a variety of different companies, which I can kind of talk through here. But just, technology, I started in kind of doing some networking and then really got into programming more. And then at this point in my career, I'm, full on, I'd call myself a developer, although I lead teams now. But my passion is always going to be, and really always has been, looking back, just writing code and building things.
Yeah, I really like that, actually, because one of the things about writing code, the way I could describe it is ageless, timeless.
Yeah.
Well, not
sometimes
exactly.
That's a bad thing too, right? Sometimes that code's around forever and you never live it down.
Yeah. Well, it's not exactly true because, back in the days, a couple hundred years ago, it's not really a thing. Actually, that's a lie because They would do stuff, but it's not exactly with, brand new technologies. Their methods are more the technology we talk about. So we could definitely dive into that in terms of, different methods of how, software engineers work nowadays because obviously with the extensive history that you have writing code, talking about code, sharing code knowledge at the end of the day, that's something that I think is super valuable. One of the cool things that he mentioned with the Commodore 64, this is kind of the first generations of computer, but the one that is interesting is that it really does sound like you really breathe technology, right? You really, given the right tools, you really get to expand your curiosity and knowledge. I'm saying this just because the opposite comparison is that back then, younger Perry, we actually had a Windows 95 available to us. But The thing is, I wasn't coding anything back then, was I? I was mostly playing Diablo, the first one on it. And it was more the idea of technology never really crossed my mind back then. So, it was kind of good that you brought up this, instinct, this, way of growing up that actually, made a lot of progress to what you are today at the end. So, really, really glad you brought that up.
And I'll add, coding isn't just... certainly the writing the code is, it's part of the productivity piece of the trade that we're in. But discovering is really, honestly, the most important part. Being able to discover new tools, discover new methodologies, new ways of building technology. Finding, and you go back to kind of what you described with Windows 95. You were in the discovery phase, and that's kind of where I was too with the Commodore 64. Is learning the capabilities of the technology and what it could do and what it couldn't do. And, I think that's a real important part of software development is being willing to dig in and understand the environment or the ecosystem that you're in, what it looks like and gain that expertise. And so it's not surprising to me that you kind of had that experience too, where you had the Windows 95 computer and you were just kind of digging in there and learning about it. That's, I equate that to you start a job at a new company and you've got a big code base you have to learn. You don't jump in there, just start writing code all the time. Like a lot of times you're going in there and you're learning what's this code base about, what methodologies, patterns, interactions, those types of things. What's going on within this code base, and you kind of go through that detective discovery phase where you're learning about that. And I think that's just kind of baked into a lot of folks who are really passionate about development, is that curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I can definitely relate myself when you talk about stuff like that. So one of the cool things as well that you mentioned is that with your kids as well, I feel like the influence is there, right? The way you live, you also breathe it, and I'm pretty sure that kind of spills over to the people around you. So I'm pretty sure the kids already have good influence in terms of this direction of understanding technology and just making the most out of it. But one thing that I actually am interested even more is yourself. As a kid, back then, what did it look like a lot? As in, where are you from? Were you surrounded by a lot of tech from a young age, aside from the Commodore 64 that you did mention already?
There was a lot of video games, things like that. We played video games, but I think I'll be honest with you, my love for technology, well, it was very early. I was into electronics, so I would go to Radio Shack and I would get these, they called them science kits, and you could build circuits and things like that. So I was involved in technology at an early age, from that perspective as well. And what I've always really enjoyed was you can build things. So, you take a variety of different circuits, put them together, and in the end you get an AM radio. There's a product, there's a thing that you can use that provides utility and function that comes from that. And that's the part I've always really been interested in. So I would say, when I was growing up, we didn't have the internet, things like that. That connectivity wasn't quite there. But as I did get older, we had this concept called a bulletin board system, which was a BBS. I miss those, because think of it in terms of, you have a lot of little internets and they're localized. So you would call up a local phone number and it was basically somebody's computer answering calls, which they might have had multiple phone lines hooked up to it. And you'd call in and you'd all be on the same platform. So you could chat, you could play games together, you could share files, things like that. And that was really kind of the precursor to the internet. So we had those types of things, and I was certainly fascinated by that stuff too. But really what really drew me to technology was just being able to build things, create things. And so once I learned that software development, being able to write code, I actually learned BASIC first on the Commodore 64, and through reading materials and things like that, was able to become pretty proficient in it. That was kind of the environment that I grew up in, and so building games, connecting through those local bulletin board systems was kind of the environment that I came out of.
I find it really interesting, just because nowadays we touch a lot of software, but inherently this beginning really has a lot of hardware involvement. You know what I mean? Just because
For sure.
Obviously the machine itself, and when you're talking about building your own AM radio, and even just talking about touching networking and internet and having these localized internet, at the end of the day, hardware seemed to have played such a big major part, even more than today, just because I guess from my experience, we kind of take hardware for granted. We kind of take that it gets pushed, the limit of hardware gets pushed every year. So I really do like the fact that no matter what, at the end of the day, software people do have a love for hardware.
Well, you have to. Yeah, and it's interesting too, because hardware is more important today than ever, but it's been abstracted. So we don't, I think early on as a developer, maybe even a little bit before my time, you had to really understand the hardware you were coding for. So for the Commodore 64, for example, you had to understand. I love reading. There's a talk. I'll have to see if I can find it. I'll send it to you. There's a talk where they went through how they were able to squeeze every piece of performance out of the Commodore 64, and it involves some really crazy stuff. They would identify that writing a loop on the Commodore 64, because it had such a slow processor, was too expensive. It was too many CPU cycles. So what they would actually do is they would write loops that would write code that would then be executed, and that was faster, and it was able to achieve the desired effect on that CPU by really, it's almost like you think about it, it's like pre-caching the instructions by writing them out ahead of time. And I'm amazed at that type of thing, because like you had to have a deep understanding of the hardware in order to really write the software that would desire or create what you were trying to create. Now we have cloud computing, things like that, so that's all been abstracted from us to some extent. We'll write some code and we'll ship it up to some type of platform as a service or infrastructure as a service or whatever. And if it's not fast enough, we just throw more processing horsepower at it. It might be more money, but you know what I mean. We don't have to worry about those limitations quite as much. Now we're thinking more in terms of scale, and this thing needs to handle 1 million requests, so we need to somehow build this in a way where it can be distributed, things like that. Our problems, I feel, have changed a little bit, but definitely hardware was a real important factor back then, because you didn't have distributed computing and cloud capacity and things like that. You were forced to work within the constraints of that particular piece of hardware. So I do miss that a little bit. I feel like there was kind of a challenge associated with that. But we have new challenges, that are, and honestly, probably even more complex to deal with today. So.
Yeah, one of the examples that I keep on, I guess, coming up to my mind whenever you mention these limitations is that if you notice a lot of the older languages like C, etc., like they have a lot more emphasis in terms of performance as well, as you were mentioning, like in terms of how many memory allocations you give to it.
Yeah, you're doing your own memory management.
Exactly. And that a lot of us take it for granted nowadays, that we don't even know it's a problem sometimes. You don't even notice it is. And the other concepts that do come up, there's the cache and also the garbage collection. That has like a big major factor on obviously how the program is going to perform at the end, depending on the language. So funny enough, these are all, I guess, like concepts that you would touch inside of like a CS degree. And I feel like that's kind of like the difference when people ask you like what kind of, I guess, topic or what kind of stuff do you talk about in a CS that you wouldn't get otherwise. These kind of stuff come up. And I feel like that's mainly, I guess, influential to kind of give you an idea of like how much time somebody has spent asking these questions about the actual like intricate parts of certain languages. But yeah, actually mentioning just like degree wise, did you have like a educational background that is very heavy in tech back then, or how did that look like?
Well, in order to explain that, I need to tell a little bit of a backstory here. The quick answer is I do not actually have a degree, and that's something I honestly feel like was maybe a bad decision early in my career. It gave me some skills that possibly I might not have otherwise, but I feel having a degree would have helped me a lot. But here's kind of how that shook out. I started out of high school. I always knew I wanted to be a programmer, or I wanted to be involved in technology somehow. I started going to a local technical college for networking. And while I was doing that, I took a job. It wasn't far from my home in a photo lab, which I'll probably have to describe what that is. Professional photographers, we always see in the movies, like they're developing their own negatives in a dark room. That's not actually how it works with professional photographers. They will shoot like a photo album for a wedding or for a high school or a school, pictures, proms, things like that. They'll shoot those pictures, and then they'll take, at least back in the day, they would take those negatives from those shoots, and they would send them to a professional lab. So I went to work for one of those professional labs, and I started by running a machine where you would have a stack of negatives next to you, and they would be what they called carded, which means they had a cardboard kind of frame around them, around the negative, that allowed them to be inserted into this machine and printed. It sounds kind of on the surface pretty basic, but it was really a complex operation. And the way that it worked was you'd put that negative on the machine, and you would punch it into the computer, and it would turn on a red light for a certain period of time, it turned on a green light for a certain period of time, and then a blue light for a certain period of time. And that period of time for each of those colors was driven by what the computer had added into its system. And obviously doing that would drive how that negative was printed on that photographic paper. So the reason I'm kind of getting into this is I learned really a lot of basic concepts about manufacturing while working there. I ran one machine. There was probably like 17 or 18 of these machines, and they were all different, had different capabilities. And the way that it worked is you would get a stack of negatives, and all day long, you're just putting these things in there, printing them. And there's a lot of stuff you had to do, making sure that there was no dust on the negative. Just our focus was quality. And that's the reason why the photographer would send the negative to the lab, was to make sure that it was printed properly. And that meant there was no like defects or artifacts on the print, and that the color was correct, which was like the key. So what was interesting about this whole thing, like going back, back in time, is I learned basic manufacturing concepts, and I functioned on a station. So printing on one of these printers, I was printing at a station, and there was different stations. There was a station for looking at the final product and writing down potential color corrections that had to be made, or determining that there was some type of flaw in that picture and sending it back, to the printers. And everybody worked in these stations, and there was a flow of how the negative flowed through the lab. And I eventually, as I worked there over the years, I would take on. I was trained in different stations, and I learned different areas that I could help contribute to the process in. And what I started to understand is that there was a system here, and that the entire thing was designed to ensure a high level and high degree of quality, and everybody playing their part contributed to that. The reason this is kind of important is further on in my career, I started learning about whip limits and Kanban boards and columns and the flow of work. And I always correlated it back, or related it back to that job that I had, where I understood that the photographer was sending the raw idea to us via negative. And I think in terms of software development, we get a really loose piece of functionality or requirement that the business or the product manager wants us to produce. And in my mind, that's the same thing as what that photographer was sending in, is they were sending in a raw negative. And what we would do is we would iteratively work on that negative. We would send it through the printer. I would print it, and somebody would take a look at it and say, okay, this is good, but we need to make these enhancements. We need a little bit more blue, or we need a little bit more red. We need to maybe, make some changes to how it's positioned on the card, things like that. And it was a very iterative process, and it reminds me a lot, and it reminds me a lot of how we do software development. We get that story. It's got the AC on there. We produce it. We ship it. We get feedback, and then we make some changes to it. And so when I started later in my career to understand, those agile processes, it always related back in my mind to what I had learned in the manufacturing world, and kind of how that stuff shook out. The other thing too, I really understood well, was context switching, like the problem with it, because one of the challenges that I had when I was running these machines is every time they would change. So we had different crop sizes based on the size of the film. So if you had 35 millimeter, you had to run one crop. If you had 120, you had to run another. Every time they changed that and they sent me a different type, I had to recalibrate the entire machine, and I had to pull out pieces, and I had to really set it up. And it took me usually about 30 minutes to recalibrate that machine. And again, I look back to developers, like asking them to context switch is really the same thing. You give them a piece of work, and when they change it out, or when you change it out, you say, well, stop working on that thing and go do this thing. There's a process that they have to go through that causes them to really have to recalibrate in their minds, and kind of get back up and running on the thing that they were working on. So I was able to take a lot of stuff out of that experience. But anyway, so back to my story here. I was working there for a while, and I realized I'm really into computers. I want to do stuff with the computers. I was going to technical school, and I told the general manager, hey, is there anything I could do here that involves working on some type of technology? And she said, well, not right now, but we'll keep you in mind. So at some point, I finally decided, well, this isn't, I'd like to, I'm passionate about this stuff. I want to do it full time. So I went and worked for a while with an internet service provider as a support technician, and just took phone calls. And I did that for some time. And eventually this company called me back and said, hey, Mark, we know you want to do computers. You were a really hard worker. Come back and we have something for you. So I went in, and I talked to them, and it was really cool. It was perfect timing, because the opportunity that they provided me with was they were launching a new online, back then it was online because the internet was around at that point, online process for photographers to submit digital photos and kind of interact with the lab online. And this is something that was really new. Most labs were just getting into it. And they said, look, we need somebody to run that and figure that out. I was like, cool, this is exactly what I'm looking for. So I went back over there in this new role. And what I realized is that the level of automation with digital wasn't there where it was with optical. And I realized a lot of this needs to be automated. And so I started writing software. Like I got some image libraries, I was building stuff on Linux back then, brought in, I think it was Image Magic or something like that. I started writing different programs that would help automate the workflow within the lab with the goal of trying to create a similar type of automation that I had seen we called it optical side of things. And that's where I really was able to start coding professionally. And it was cool because like nobody was telling me, here's what you need to build. I was just kind of like, I had that goal in mind. I said, I want to make this lab automated and streamlined. So I'm going to just start building the tools that they need to do that. And it was a great opportunity. Anyway, so long story short, I got so encompassed in that and focused on that I stopped going to school at that time. And then I never really went back and picked it up because I was, every day I was writing code and I was building things, and it just, I didn't go back. Honestly, that was a bit of a disadvantage to me later on in my career, because I think there's a lot of principles and things that a CS degree would have armed me for, and probably maybe made my life a little bit easier. But that's just kind of how it shook out for me.
I think there's actually so many good points that you brought up in this, I guess, really good story. Just because, like, if we just even talk back about CS back then, I don't even think there was like an official like degree, I guess, with CS. I feel like that was more like a newer thing that the trend is already like very popular nowadays. I don't know if there was the direct exact equivalent of computer science at X university.
I don't even remember, to be honest with you. It may or may not have existed. I'm sure there was something close to it if it didn't exist. The hardest part I had was a lot of, even in the technical college, a lot of the things I was struggling with is it felt like at least the school I was in was a little bit outdated, and they were talking about mainframes and things like that, and I was like, well, mainframes are still a thing, but most development is now being done in Windows, and like, where's the Windows development and stuff like that. So yeah, they were there. It was it was a thing back then, but I just personally struggled with it because I learned better through hands-on practical, like here's something we want to build, go figure out how to build it type of thing.
Yeah, funny enough, I could definitely relate to it because even I come from somebody who actually went to university for a comp sci degree, which, I mean, just for the record, doesn't make you like 100% ahead just because you have a CS degree at the end of the day. I've met so many engineers out there who don't have a CS degree, and they're far exceedingly better engineers than the average. So I think that's like, it's something, but it doesn't really paint the whole picture. Just because I guess one of the great examples that you just really mentioned was that the passion really trumps the actual technical educational background at the end of the day. Just because, I mean, from what we actually learned so far is that having this understanding of what you're doing and what it could lead to is so important, on top of the fact that you actually reached out. So that's not something that they teach you in school, right? Like, nobody asked you to ask the manager back then to be like, hey, let me know if there's anything interesting related to this part. So these are the kind of stuff that, it's good that you mentioned it, because that kind of gives an idea of not what you learned in school, but the person that you are at the end of the day. And I think it's to everybody's advantage to really have this mindset of just ask. Nobody's going to lose anything from asking at the end of the day. It's the same thing as if you didn't ask. It's the same thing as if nothing happened, in the bigger picture. So one of the things that I do want to point out is that when you're saying that, like, maybe back then if you did a CS degree, you would have done better in this thing. I think like the outcomes far outweigh nowadays the decision that you made back then. Just because if you stuck with the degree, maybe you would have missed on all these other opportunities that really built to what you are doing today. So,
I definitely agree. I feel that there was a ton of benefit to be good. Honestly, just throwing yourself in and like going in blind a little bit. And I, with that said, as I've kind of grown up in my career here, I've also realized that there's a lot of value in doing some research and having some level of expertise before. There's a balance. I think being unafraid to pursue something is important. Like, and it's hard. Like, you look at something you don't know or you don't understand, and there's other people that do it, and it's difficult to feel or to kind of push yourself to just jump into that. But going back to what you said, if it's something you're passionate about, if it's something you care about, first of all, do it your own way. Like if you're the type of person where you want to research something and you want to know everything about that particular topic before you jump in, that's you. That's how you're wired. Do that. If you're the type of person where you want to test the waters and you just want to get in there and get your hands dirty, do that. Don't be afraid to take whatever approach you feel comfortable with, but try to understand your passions. And like you said, do take those steps to reach out, talk to people, tell people what you want to do. I don't think there's many bosses out there that would look down on somebody for saying like, hey, this is what I want to do. And if you have an opportunity for me to contribute value to the company in this way, let me know. Why would you look bad at that, or down on that? I think that's somebody expressing an interest to be part of the organization and just in a way that they feel they can be more productive. So you're right. That's a real important thing for especially people just getting into the career to understand. With that said, you may be told no. I was, she said no, we don't have anything for you now. But later on, it came back and it paid off. So
yeah, and for the better, we could definitely agree on that.
Yeah.
One of the cool things is that the other part of when people mention, I guess, like these CS degrees or these degrees in technology, like a lot of times, well, I guess from my experience, they're very theoretical. So a lot of stuff that we were talking about is very conceptual, like obviously how functional programming languages work, how currying works, like stuff like that. But the thing is, even just reflecting on what you've lived through is, when you're talking about very hands-on experience, that is so much more valuable. And I think like modern, I guess, programs are very aware of that. And that's why they try to incorporate more, like whether it's a study or a work like mandatory semester, like they really try to put this hands-on feel to it, because I think from even my experience, the moment I actually got more hands-on, you could clearly see this like inflection point of like tech knowledge and software knowledge that really stuck with me. So I guess hands-on knowledge, I'll 100% recommend it to anybody. I think that's definitely a bigger chunk of, I guess, what made me, and seems like what made you at the end of the day.
That's a great point. I think that is one of the advantages of the CS degree too, is you get the opportunity to interact with other people who are also learning. It's funny because as I talk to interns and junior developers that are kind of coming out of the program, when I ask them to kind of reminisce and go back and tell me about things that they learned and that they've done, they a lot of times gravitate towards those projects that they've worked on with other people. And, you go through all of this curriculum and you're learning all these things, but the things you really remember are the times when you were building something with other people. And that's a big thing that I've learned in my career, is building things with other people is probably the most important thing you can do as far as career development, because that's where you gain a perspective from others. You really do learn. You learn both because you're hearing those other perspectives, but you're also exercising kind of your skills at the same time. And it's a really cool thing. And I think it's easier to do that in an environment an academic scenario, because you have a larger pool of people to work with who are kind of at your level.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the cool things, I mean, we could talk about CS degrees all day long, honestly. The lesson at the end of the day here is that, like, whether you have or don't have a CS degree, like, you can become so successful or, like, very content with what you do at the end of the day involving with technology if you just ask the questions and follow really what you're interested about. So that's something that I guess we could all learn about. Me still today, I can still learn from that.
We can all learn from that.
Yeah. One of the cool thing is when you were talking about, I mean, this really, I don't know, it stuck to my mind for a second. When you're saying you spent 30 minutes recalibrating the machines every time. I mean, looking back from, the solution here was that you would have saved settings, right? Like if you knew the setting would be this one, then you'd have different settings.
Yeah, that's a great question. The solution was actually, and this is what we did, you didn't constantly context switch. You minimized that. So what you did is you batched the work up. You put all of the, you had different film sizes. So you would always do all of the different film sizes together. So you would do one big box of 35 millimeter. And then when you're done with that, then you go through the context switch and then you do the next big box. And that was weird sometimes because you would have customers that would actually send, that would shoot in multiple formats. So they'd shoot some of their photos in 120 and some of it in 35 millimeter. And what you had to do is actually split their orders up. and then process them that way and then put them back together at the end, which was turned out to be far more efficient because you limited the number of context switches. And again, going back to kind of how software development works, it's one thing to consider is, say you have a project and it requires a bunch of work on a service, and you have, say, 6 stories that involve changes to some core service. You might want to consider bundling that together and not as one story, but flowing that through the board all together so that, the team can just kind of stay focused on that service and just like really kind of get in the groove on that thing, knock all that work out, and then move on to the next. Doesn't always apply, but those are the types of things that I did learn. I think the key there was really that context switch. Throughout my entire development career, I've always been really sensitive to context switching. Even on a personal level, I try to avoid it as much as possible because I feel like if you're constantly shifting gears, you're wasting a lot of time and you're potentially not going to be doing good, solid work. It's not going to be quality work.
Oh yeah, I think every engineer on top of their head, like, they hate overhead. Anytime you could like minimize overhead, this is the obsession. Which is why we end up being really geeky and nerdy about stuff. It's because we want to minimize this overhead at the end of the day.
Yeah, we're optimizers. We like to do things in optimal ways. That's part of engineering.
And the cool thing is, so you're mentioning like basically, like your first professional job at writing code at the end of the day is really in this awesome industry of like photography at the end of the day, where you got to, what language were you actually coding in at that time?
I was doing mostly C, I think. I was actually doing a little bit of PHP for their website because we built like an online portal for them so that customers could go see like the status of their orders and things like that, which I was really proud of. I ended up actually building another system that allowed the photographers to upload their digital images and would then allow them to crop them online and stuff like that. We did that in Java. It was actually a Java applet. I'm kind of embarrassed to say that, but we built a Java applet because we didn't have, JavaScript wasn't real. It was there, but it wasn't optimized. So you didn't have, you didn't have Chrome V8 where it was, extremely efficient and things like that. So we had to build Java applets to do those types of things. We did some PHP, C. I think I actually had to write in a proprietary language that Kodak had created for their platform because they built a lot of the technology that the lab started using to manage workflow and things like that. So that was very C-like. So it was mostly a lot of that lower level stuff. Just because, again, the hardware wasn't quite there. We didn't have cloud, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you really try to make the best of all tools that you're given at that time. Same thing for us nowadays. We have all these tools that, like, we comparatively to back then, obviously we take a lot of stuff for granted that they're so much more powerful. But if we look at this kind of timeline that maybe in 10, 20 years, there's going to be even more greater stuff. And then we look back at, hey, we used to use JavaScript back then. There's always this, like, evolution of technology. But it's really good to hear from you that, like, even back then, like, the commitment and the level of expertise being using C and PHP and all these technologies, like, it is still exposed today, and I really do think people do appreciate knowing that you can learn about Java, you can learn about how impactful they've been to, I guess, any industry. At the end of the day, back then, it was just depends on how you use it. So
yeah, and it's all still around, which is amazing. People are still doing stuff with it. So
speaking of different industry, actually, you didn't only work in the photography industry. Actually, you really touched on different kind of like organizations and stuff. Did you end up staying a long time at the photography position, or did you actually end up using your software skills and developing other stuff?
Yeah, so I was there for a few years and then decided to move on. And I really bounced around quite a bit. From there, I went and worked for a while at a bank as kind of a product analyst role, which was really interesting. I didn't do a lot of coding there, but it kind of taught me some of the necessary skills to kind of understand how to align business and technology with business requirements and things like that. So that was good. I did that for a while. I worked at, really back then, one of the cool jobs that I had was one of the first, I would say it's one of the early SaaS companies. It was a company called MortgageBot. I think they're called Finestra right now. They built online mortgage application, an online mortgage application system for banks. And what was really cool about that experience, and I worked there as I think it was just a normal software developer there. It exposed me to this concept that you can create an application that can serve multiple customers, but it's one single application. And I was like, this is cool. you can build something that still can be customized and still can offer varying options and features to a customer, but it's one code base. And I was like, this is the coolest thing I've seen in a long time. And it introduced me to this concept of software as a service. And so I learned a lot about different, feature toggles, and I learned about how to build functionality in a way where it was flexible enough to facilitate different types of customer requests. One example of that is they had a really complex system for how to determine which questions were displayed on a mortgage application, and it was super powerful. Like they could, customers could say, "I'd like to have this series of questions," and when they ask, it was almost like the modern day form builders. Nowadays you can just go buy a product that does this, but back then, they were pretty much visionaries in how they did that kind of stuff. But it was really cool because it exposed me to that concept, and then it also kind of showed me how to work a little bit more with the team. Because prior to that, I'd been really working on either really small teams or kind of by myself. When I was at Risser, I was like the only programmer there at the photo lab. But once I ended up at MortgageBot, I really started to learn, like, okay, this is how teams can work together and build things. And I started to understand that dynamic. Agile, I think at that time was becoming pretty prominent, but they were still kind of in the transition. So they were trying to understand how to utilize it. And it was cool to watch them go through that process as well. Taking large features and breaking them up into smaller features. The other thing that was cool about that situation too was there was a decent amount of tech debt already. They had things that had been written in some older technology, and they were trying to move fast and be competitive and stay ahead of their, the other folks that were trying to do that stuff. And they were running into a lot of this tech debt stuff. So they were constantly challenged with, hey, we've got to rewrite this big complicated, and this is finance, this is mortgage applications, so there's some really complex stuff in there. And they were in the position where, like, we got to rewrite this thing now because we need to do more with it, and it's so hard to do things with this. So just kind of living through that was a really cool experience, and gave me really my first taste of what product development looks like, which is a whole different animal than, I'd say enterprise or kind of like business initiative supporting type of software development. Product development is a very different type of development. It requires more speed, requires more consistent progress, those types of things. And I was like, this is really cool. It was eye opening.
Yeah, even that space, that mortgage space, like, it's multi-billion-dollar industry. Even today, there's so many products revolve into it, and when you're saying it's very sensitive, like, any kind of factor could influence, how you build stuff at the end of the day. And if your code has leaky
absolutely.
bugs, then you're kind of in a bit of a trouble at the end of the day. But
well, yeah, their big challenge is regulatory. And I've worked at a couple different companies that deal with finance, and regulatory is huge because the government, the federal government can put restrictions in place for things, and then you as a software company have to support those because your customer's expecting that. That's one of the things you're providing to them is potentially compliance with regulatory aspects. So being a software development team that can quickly build something is important because things are changing. They're in flux all the time, and you just have to be able to respond and provide the customer with that level of functionality. So that happened to me while I was there. The government had put some kind of policy in place, and we built the technology to support it, and then the government decided they weren't going to do it anymore, so we just turned that off. So yeah, that was definitely finance, especially SaaS finance companies, are really, really interesting just because of the way they have to kind of operate on those types of things. So
yeah, and even looking at from, I guess, the engineer's lens, from when you're working on the engineering side, like, not only do you obviously have to worry about the technical aspect to it, but as you were mentioning, like, just because of all these other restraints and requirements, you end up having a lot of business knowledge and business impacts that you have to adhere to. So yep. I think, like, just being as a software engineer is like yes, the focus, make sure that the code is good and like the engineering operations is great. But it's also very much on your responsibility to understand the business, to understand what kind of impact that if these decisions are made, then this is the outcome of that decision. So I think that's something that I love that you brought up, just because every day, even for me, like, I do have to understand that everything I do is technical, but also very much business impactful at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. Like we're not, people aren't necessarily paying us just to write code. They're paying us to produce something of value to other people. And that means understanding the business. The business ultimately represents that value that's being provided to customers or target user base or whatever, however it works within the organization you work for. And so being able to translate that code that you're writing, or have that context in your mind, like, hey, I'm building this. It needs to have a high level of quality. It needs to work. It needs to scale. It needs to do all the things that from an engineering perspective, I'm kind of responsible for overseeing. But then you really do serve yourself well to think about, what am I trying? Like, what is this thing actually accomplishing? I'll say this though too. It's hard for us to do that unless we have good product managers, and that was another thing I experienced at MortgageBot, was we had really good product managers. They understood what the industry needed, and they were great at articulating that to us, and those types of things really paid off. So like, we would be building something, and they would say, here's why you're building it, and getting that context was helpful. But you're right, like, you have to be willing to kind of think about those things too, because you are a player in that process. Going back to Risser, when I was printing the negatives, if I was printing that negative and I saw something, the negative was ripped or there was something wrong with it, it was my responsibility to go back to the inspectors or to the manager and say, hey, there's some problems with this thing for this customer. You need to go back and contact them and let them know. So being part of that team is definitely critical, and understanding the business aspects of what you're building is definitely important.
I'll double and triple emphasize on being a team, like teamwork, being a good teammate, being like part of the whole teamwork, like triple emphasize it, just because we obviously talk about software engineers a lot, but I don't think I'll be able to do my job as well without PMs and PDs and product designers, project managers, product managers out there. So I think this synergy is super important wherever,
absolutely,
if you get exposed to any kind of opportunity to be working with more PMs and more product designers and everybody else involved into it, please do it. That's probably one of the advice that I'll be able to share with people.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're totally right, Perry. I think that comes down to kind of understanding, back to what you were saying originally, is your passion. Like, if you're interested in being a generalist and you want to kind of be involved in all the different pieces, then maybe something to think about is, one of these companies where they don't have, a PM as a formal role, or it's an internal thing and they don't, they have BAs, and, you have the opportunity to kind of fill some of that role. But if you're somebody who really just wants to focus on engineering and be a really good engineer, that's great too. Like, everybody's different. And in that case, then you're probably going to want to work for a company that does have strong PM management, and a company that's going to really do a lot of that, figuring out what it is we need to build for you, and then expecting you just to do a stellar job of actually getting it out and making it scalable and making it high quality. So it all comes back to just like, and it's hard, but trying to figure out what it is you want to do, where you feel your strengths are, and what strengths you want to build on and excel at.
And another agree from me. This cool thing is that we're still discovering this journey, actually, of like you becoming, like, at the beginning very hardware focused, but then next thing you know, you're kind of blooming into this software knowledge and expertise as you go. Everybody has this kind of journey to, I guess, like, leveling up your seniority and your experience at the end of the day. So what kind of that look like as you were working, I guess, at MortgageBot? You were coming in as a software developer, but what did that journey look like after to get into, I guess, these higher, knowledgeable, more senior looking positions?
Yeah, I think at that time I realized, it's funny because it kind of ties back in what we were just talking about. I realized I am a little bit more of a generalist, and I wanted to experience more, more of the business side of things. And MortgageBot was great. They had the business side figured out, and what they really needed was really, like I said, top-notch engineers that could just go in there and rewrite things, and it just wasn't me at the time. And so I at that time decided, well, I'm going to try to strike it on my own, and I've got some good relationships with people. I'm going to try to start my own consulting business. And so I took on a couple of customers, and I really just kind of set it up like, hey, you've got some projects you need. I've got some time. We'll set up a billable, hour plan here, and you'll hire me to work on projects for you. And I struck out. It was great. It was what I always wanted to do. It was the most stressful time of my entire life, because realizing you don't have, you were completely responsible for your own destiny at that point, and making sure, that you keep work coming in. It was one of those things where at first it was really hard, and I worked too much, and I didn't take enough time to kind of take care of myself, and I burned out pretty good in the beginning. Over time, I started to level out, and I started to figure out kind of how it worked. And what I was able to do is build up a good number of consistent clients that were able to feed me work. And I basically just wrote code for people for quite some time. And I had a couple of really interesting clients. Some of them were in the marketing space, so they would need like a developer to help them with the more technical aspects of a website project. And so I had some really good relationships with some marketing firms that needed that type of expertise. I worked with a company that did kind of some supply management, supply chain management type of thing. So I was able to get some exposure to those types of industries when you have suppliers and vendors and things like that. And I was able to help them build their product. That was another software as a service business. So I was able to kind of take what I had learned over at MortgageBot and apply some of that over there as well for them. I worked in the healthcare space. So believe it or not, large hospitals, at least at the time, they had, specifically the area I worked in was laboratory testing. They had some specific needs, and the big software vendors that serviced them, weren't fulfilling those needs. So I was able to fill in some gaps there. That's a really interesting industry right now, especially with the pandemic. They are, the companies, the laboratories that are going out there and providing these tests to help people determine if they have have COVID or not, are really having to get creative because it's just the volume is really increased in that space. So, but anyway, so I was able to do some work there, and then I also worked with some more companies that do finance, and again that regulatory stuff, those types of things. So it was really cool. It was a really cool time of my life because I related to being like in the Wild West. I was all over the place. I was working with a lot of different companies, getting a lot of different experience. But here is the thing, is I really missed working with teams. I was on my own. I was kind of by myself. And I found that while my business acumen and my experience grew, from an engineering and technology perspective, I wasn't growing. I wasn't learning new technologies. I was not doing well with modern, like Agile was something I understood, but I didn't really know it well enough to consider myself proficient with like some of the concepts and stuff like that. And again, a lot of it went back to just not spending time with people and teams and other engineers. And it really missed it after a while. So at a certain point, I decided to kind of go back to the full-time world and work for a company again. And that's when I got to Circa, and that's where I work now. And I was brought in really to lead some teams and kind of drive, the development effort. And Circa is a software as a service company, and it's a product company. And so it's a great opportunity to take all of those different experiences that I've kind of lived through, but apply it to what I care most about, and that is helping others and building these teams that, not only are productive, but teams where people can walk in the door, engineers can walk in the door, or BAs or PMs or whoever can walk in the door and actually like want to work there and know what it is that they need to build and grow personally, both with soft skills and technical skills. That's what I found I cared the most. And it took going through all of this stuff to finally realize like that's what I care most about, is building these teams and being part of these teams and accomplishing goals together and creating things and just like taking it all the things I realized I cared about and pulling it all together and making it something that I get to do every day. And I'm extremely excited to be in that position.
Yeah, in my head this whole time I had this High School Musical song going on saying like, we're all in this together.
Yeah, we kind of are. And I think it's once you realize that it's not just, you're not just doing it for other people, you're doing it for yourself, because you just can't grow. Like I've always said, you can build your own technical skills up on your own, go read some blogs and spend time doing it. But what you can't do is change your perspective and your thinking without the opinions of other people. And you get kind of stuck into this like single mindset that you just can't get out of unless you expose yourself to other people. So some people do that by reading books, and that's or blogs, things like that. That's great. But for me personally, it's always required daily interaction with other people. I need to be able to talk to other people, understand what their struggles are, share my struggles, talk about technology, get have disagreements. That type of stuff is important in order to really kind of evolve yourself and get to that next step in your career.
Oh yeah, you definitely want to expose yourself to any kind of engineers. Like we always talk about the great engineers, but also you do want to get exposed to the lesser dumb ones like me.
No, I would never say that, Perry. I'll be honest with you. That as I've kind of gone through my career, the engineers that really teach me a lot are the ones that are just starting out, because first of all, it's a whole new world right now. Like what I learned back then was valuable from an experience perspective, but it's not all applicable anymore. Like you're jumping into an ecosystem now where there's hundreds of tools to choose from. That's a problem in itself. That's a whole new problem. And so like what I'm really learning from the younger generation of engineers is like how to adapt to the sheer complexity and the fast pace of software development now. So definitely don't sell yourself short, man. You have an amazing kind of perspective and experience on this stuff, or a set of experiences on this stuff that's valuable to people in my position. And I've found personally that those conversations with the folks that are kind of at that level are extremely valuable. And it's part of, again, why I like being in this position is I love just talking to developers. It's my favorite thing to do. And talking to developers that, are just kind of getting started is fascinating. And there's just so much to learn from it.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, I appreciate the kind words there. I always love hearing those once in a while. One of the cool things that really, I guess, like fuels me as a software engineer for the past at least 4 or 5 years now is mostly just asking questions that it can be dumb. Like, dumb questions are perfectly fun. There are no stupid questions at the end of the day. You could just ask them, and then if it's a dumb question, then yeah, you'll realize it's a dumb question, and you'll just be more knowledgeable at the end. So I think that really what fuels me whenever I do anything like this, working at my job or just, doing these podcasts at the end. Sorry. It's just I'm genuinely curious about how other people work, and you just sharing, the processes back then of how imaging works. That's already super fascinating to me. One of the other great thing that you made a great picture out of, pun intended, is basically
nice. Well done.
When you're talking about full-time versus being an entrepreneur, being like on a contract, basically being a contractor, just because on one end, the full-time, you have a bit of stuff that is taken for granted, such as, I guess some paid holidays is taken for granted when you're a full-time versus a contractor. Yeah. And on the other side, when you're saying like, yeah, it stresses out. If you think that full-time stresses you out, yes, like it does stress you out working full-time, depending on the role and everything. Being a contractor is probably like a higher load on that because you're responsible for finding the next, project that you're working on and everything. So I think that's kind of like the point of view I had versus full-time versus contracting at the end of the day.
For sure. Yeah. There's definitely, man, I could go on, and make this a long podcast. I could talk to you about all the complexities of being a contractor. I don't want to scare anybody away from it because it's not probably as bad as I'm making it sound, but there is some things you have to think about. Like, healthcare is important. And I have a family, and that was honestly one of the big reasons why I decided that I didn't want to keep contracting was because, healthcare costs for a family is a real big challenge. But there's tax things you have to care about. Like you said, you have to keep your work coming in. You have to learn how to manage scope. That was like, I'll say this. The one thing contracting did teach me, in order to survive in that industry, you had to manage scope and you had to really do agile. And while I didn't understand the formal agile concepts, I understood the principles because I'll give you a little example. I walked in to a conference room for one of my customers one day, and they said, "We have a project we want you to work on, and it's a big one." So I went in there, and they said, we've had 2 other contractors try to do this, and it just hasn't been very successful, and we would like you to give it a shot because you've done some other work for us, and we've been happy with it. And so I got in there and I sat down with this group of people, and in front of me, they plopped this gigantic book down. And it was this, like, it had to be like 200 pages, I'm guessing, of screenshots and bullet points and lists and all sorts of things like that. And they said, "We want you to build this thing." And I'm looking at it like, what exactly is this? And, nobody really fully understood what it was. And so what I eventually realized I needed to do in order to get that project done and to do it well was I had to break it up into pieces. And I had to say, look, I'm not going to promise you I'm going to build this whole thing. I don't even know if you need this entire thing. Let's break it up into pieces, and I'll work with the manager. And every week we'll take a piece of this and we'll say, hey, do we need to do this or do we not need to do this? And we'll talk through it. We'll figure out the details and we'll build it. Anyway, long story short, We ended up getting it done. It took about a year, but the final product is still being used today. And that was years and years ago, and it supports a pretty large revenue stream. And I don't think I would have been successful. And it's not that I was a better engineer or anything than those other folks were. It's just I realized very early on that I'm just not capable of building a 200-page spec for anybody. That's just not how it works. And so that's the type of stuff I had to just learn kind of the hard way. And I guess the reason I knew that is because I probably had built larger projects before and it failed. So when you're a contractor, you really don't have those guide rails that you have in a larger company where they understand that already, and they're saying like, let's break this off and build this in pieces. You're dealing with customers who just have something that they need delivered, and it's kind of up to you to really figure out how to make that happen. With that said, if you're wired that way, and that's the type of challenge you like, then it's potentially a good thing for you to try out. But if you're really just into the engineering and you just want to build really awesome, high scalable things, then you need somebody like a BA in that role, or somebody with sales experience that knows like what you can and can't do in those types of roles. So there's that type of thing. There's the taxes. There's a lot of different things. Looking back, it was an awesome time of my life, but there's a lot of trade-offs, and I think understanding those is really important.
One of the great valuable lessons from that anecdote that you just brought up is the word pushing back. Just because as software engineers, like we tend to, I don't know if it's a general trend, but I've seen so many times where we just accept stuff as they are. Like if you're given a spec, you just accept what it is. Like I don't think that's beneficial in the long run of what you do as a person, but as what a team does at the end of the day. I think it's on the individual to know, to recognize when something is completely, do you need it, do you not need it? Is it actually worth the resource spent doing this instead of doing something else? Like this pushing back is really valuable for anybody at the end. So as you progress in terms of like being a green software engineer, somebody who's quite young, you'll mostly accept what's being given to you as you work on stuff. But I think there's a point in your, career and your mindset where you realize that you have to push back on whether something that's completely unrealistic or something that you think it's better for the bigger picture and the bigger part of the team, which I guess is always up for discussion.
Totally, 100% agree. And I think there's a finesse to pushing back. There's like maybe two types of pushing back. The first is what you described, where it's like, do you really need this thing? And the way I've done that, I've kind of worked through that is I've said things like, well, how's the customer going to use this? Like, let's talk that through, because I want to make sure I understand. And it's kind of a tricky way of forcing somebody to really stop focusing on the solution itself and to start thinking about the problem that you're trying to solve. And when you get people to start thinking about problems versus solutions, you can a lot of times find that, there's better ways of doing things, or there's some things that they don't really need, that they think they need. The other thing I would suggest too, though, for pushing back, if you're looking at something and you're saying, this isn't going to work. For example, when they dropped the book in front of me, I didn't say, well, that's stupid, I'm not going to do that. I came up with an alternative and a different solution to that. Like, hey, let's try doing it this way instead. I think it'll be better. And floating it that way, I think you find that you get a lot more traction by proposing alternatives and better solutions versus just kind of being a little bit of an obstructionist and saying, hey, this is not the greatest way to do it. And that's hard because like it requires like understanding the problem, being realistic and saying like this thing that we're trying to do isn't going to work, and then getting creative and saying, okay, well, I kind of see what they want to do, so how can I come up with another solution that I think will work, that they'll be happy with, and that will solve their problem. And that's I think again where the creativity aspect of our job kind of comes to play.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the harder part of what our job.
For sure, much harder. Yeah.
The other cool thing is, because as you, I guess, went through so much already, being full-time versus contracting at the end, you kind of end up building this baggage of knowledge. And I guess, like, this is part of the journey of anybody, living this tech world and living, this whole experience. But we could definitely talk about your current projects, your current roles, because, that's super impactful in terms of, how everybody else looks at the world. Currently, you're director of product development at Circa, but you also have a wonderful blog called 7 Samurai that has loads of great resources on it. You also have a podcast coming up. So I think that's so many different streams of projects going on. And I think one of the things that I guess I could ask is, what exactly is a director of product development to begin with?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Really, and it kind of feeds into why I started 7 Samurai too. I think making the transition from I'll call it technologist to somebody in a leadership position is tricky. It's got its own kind of challenges associated with it, especially if you've come from a developer background. So my role at Circa is really to keep that team moving, help make sure that we've got the right people in place, make sure that we're focused on the right things, make sure that our culture, I feel like making sure culture is considered and that, developers feel safe and they feel free to innovate and share and learn from each other. Making sure that the work that they need to do is well understood, because I feel like setting up a team for success means telling them what it is that, what success looks like. And I think that's part of my role, is being able to work with the business and work with my boss and work with product management and the other stakeholders within the organization and try to figure out, what does the business need in order to accomplish their initiatives, and then channel that down into the team in a way that makes sense to them. And that's got some challenges associated with it, because that means taking it and turning it in not only to requirements, it means considering architecture, it means considering our existing application portfolio, legacy technology, risks, identifying risks, dealing with support, because I'm a big believer in making sure that support is considered as part of, the development effort, because a lot of times support requires changes to the system, things like that. So really just, I've become more of an orchestrator now of trying to keep all of that work kind of flowing and moving and removing roadblocks. But I'm not actually doing the work. And that's really the challenge with making that transition from a developer to somebody in more of a leadership position. Is it's really easy to just hold on to all of that technical knowledge that I've obtained over the last 20 years. And instead I have to put myself in a different kind of mindset, one that I'm not necessarily super comfortable in all the time, which is a good thing. But put myself more in a mindset of, how do I enable people? How do I help them? How do I hold them accountable? How do I make sure that we have the right skill sets? How do I make sure that the work is making sense and that we're flowing it, those types of things. And just really, my goal is, and I'll relate it back to my work at the photo lab, making sure the entire system, that the work is flowing properly and that we don't have context switching and that we don't have, work bunching up in one area. Maybe it's getting stuck in the analysis phase, or maybe it's getting stuck in the tech design phase, or maybe it's getting stuck in this QA phase, those types of things, making sure the quality is there, and just really balancing all those things and trying to fine tune the system, with the key being understanding that it's relationships and people that ultimately makes it work. And knowing that if the developers that work at Circa understand the work and are happy and are growing and are working with each other and learning from each other, that everything is going to work. And just, trying to make sure that I'm not getting in the way of that and that I'm helping promote that type of culture. That's really what the role is currently for me. And the reason I started 7samurai.dev is I feel like there's a real gap out there. There's a lot of expertise on how to do Agile. There's a lot of expertise on how to do architecture. There's a lot of expertise on all the specific technologies, how to do TDD, how to do, those types of things. But I don't feel there's a lot of help out there for somebody who's in a development role, who wants to kind of get to that next level, wants to get into a leadership level and start helping others more, influencing others. And that's where I feel I can help, just because I have a variety of different experiences. And so 7Samurai and the podcast that I plan to launch in January is going to really focus on what are the different tools, what are different methodologies, the philosophies that are out there that I've experienced and others have experienced, to help you get into a position where you can influence others in a positive way. Because that's what I want to do. I want to I'm loving talking to you, Perry, because I feel like I'm giving an opportunity to maybe give you some stuff, and you're giving me all sorts of ideas back. Just kind of take that to another level and just really put that out there. And so 7samurai.dev, I'm planning to just produce more articles that just really focus on. Sometimes it might be technical, but more often than not, it's going to be about mindsets and philosophies that you can employ to kind of get yourself to that next level.
I really do like the description that you had, I guess, for your role, because it's basically the hardest challenge to have this marriage between the methodological system and the marriage between that and also the human appreciation. Because at the end of the day, software engineers are human at the end. So that balance between making sure that all of those parts work together, it's definitely a hard job. And you being there and really sharing your knowledge and making sure that everybody gets to enjoy their work and the impact that they've got is definitely valuable. So yeah, appreciate those those responsibilities. And I think the other great point that you mentioned is this kind of distancing between you and I guess some of the code base, some of the direct technological work. It's always a debate that everybody in, I guess, a lot of software engineers out there tries to think about and tries to debate. Because even for myself, like, yeah, I touch a lot of code nowadays, but is that everybody's path? Is somebody always happy to touch it, or is somebody not happy to not be able to contribute directly to the code base? So I think, like, if we talk about these concepts, like, it's very prominent between different companies to address them, especially considering how there's different paths, which is, I guess, one of them is the IC, which is the individual contributors, compared to the engineer manager role, which is, like, you know, slightly further away from the code base. So I think these are always, like, questions that people ask themselves all the time. And I think, like, the better way of, you know, just figuring out what you yourself want to be is just talk about it, which is basically what we do nowadays is, if I have a question about should I go down this path, should I go down that path, then yeah, just ask around. Everybody has their own opinion, and I'm pretty sure you talk to a lot of the people that you work with about this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I think you're dead on. I think the key there is you're learning what your options are, you know, and the only way you can understand your options are to talk to other people and see kind of where they see themselves going and what they're doing and what their current experience and past experiences are. It's, you know, it's obtaining information from others through those stories that they have, and that's the kind of thing too that's hard to find. You can't just go to the internet and say, hey, show me all the different experiences that people have had in the software development realm so that I can try to figure out how I want to craft mine to look. Like, that's, Google isn't going to answer that query very well. You know, it only comes from talking to people. And I think, to your point, like, some people are much happier in that individual contributor role, and that's great. Like, we need people who want to do that. You know, some people want to do other things, and it's okay, you know, to kind of have your strengths, build off of your strengths and the things you're passionate about and the things you care about, and then start to understand here's the key is, like, start to understand what your options are and where you can provide value. Because if you can marry up your passion with the ability to provide people with value, it's fulfilling. You can make a decent living, and it's something that you can do long term. It'll be hard. You still may burn out, but it's going to be a lot easier to not burn out if you've kind of found that balance and found that fit. And the only way to get there is network, talk to people, you know, involve yourself in the development community and the people that are out there.
Yeah, and I'll definitely agree again on that. Just because I guess, like, one of the great thing about 7samurai.dev with the resources out there is that you do touch a lot of these topics. Like, some of the topics that you do mention is just our everyday lives as software engineers, right? When we talk about stand-ups, when we talk about how the teams work, even I guess there's a term called the two pizza team, where we could definitely talk about, I guess it'll be for another discussion, but the resources available on 7samurai is definitely really relevant for these kind of discussions. When I was saying stand-ups, code reviews, how to lead tech teams, those are all definitely stuff that we love talking about. Well, I'll speak for myself that I love talking about. And I guess for somebody who, you know, what kind of advice would you have somebody to want to share these knowledges? So, like, in terms of, because you've created a, you know, really good resource out there. If somebody wants to do the same, what kind of advice would you give them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think what I've discovered recently is if you want to create something like that, it's difficult because it took me a long time to get there, but you need to find, again, what you're passionate about. And sometimes it takes just, like, trying some stuff out to figure that out and be real. Like, I've tried to create a couple things in the past, and I got maybe a month or two into them, and I realized, I'm just really not into this. I just, you know, it was kind of exciting at first, but now I just don't, you know, it's not enough there. I can't get myself to think about it enough. And you got to find that thing that you really care about, that you can use to power whatever that content is. And sometimes it helps, I think, to look back at your history and kind of try to understand what it is you've done and gravitated towards and those types of things. But I think it starts with just figuring out what is the thing that it really drives you, that you care about, that you can wake up in the morning and say, yeah, I want to talk about that, and I want to tell other people about that. Start there. And then take that and turn it into something that can help people solve their problems. I guarantee if you're passionate about something, you can use that to help people solve problems, because the reason you're passionate about it is probably solving problems for you. So figure out, how do I frame that and turn that into something that can help people. My goal with Seven Samurai is to try to not get too philosophical at a high level, but to really just, like you said, just boil it down to daily things that you can really do to influence your team. The stand-up thing is, everybody does stand-ups, and anybody who participates in a stand-up hopefully has the opportunity to contribute and influence that process and talk about it and change it and make it better. You don't even have to be in a leadership position. I encourage our teams. I'm a big believer in autonomous teams, and I don't believe in dictating to a team how they should run their ceremonies. And so the team should be able to influence that themselves. And if you're part of a team, you should be able to say, hey guys, why are we talking so much about all the stuff from yesterday? We should be talking about what we need to do to push this work forward, because I think that'll, we'll get out of there quicker, and we'll achieve our goal, which is to walk out of that meeting with a good sense of what we need to do for the day, and just have those types of conversations and arm people with those, not only the topics, but just maybe some of the I'd say some of the value associated with doing things in a certain way. Just trying to get people to at least think. Even if you go to my site and you look at some of these articles and you adamantly disagree, that's cool, because you probably have some different experiences than I do, and I guarantee you're probably right. And I haven't thought of those things, but I liked creating the conversation. Let's talk about these things, and let's kind of keep moving forward and improve continuously. And that's my goal for the site, is just to help people start to think in that kind of way, and also give them the confidence to have those conversations. Just because you're an engineer doesn't mean you can't talk about what stand-up looks like and how it functions and flows. You have a say in that.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I mean, those are all super useful tips for just sharing knowledge. And at the end of the day, it's really selfless, just because sharing is definitely one of the greater things you could do as an individual, not as a software engineer, but just as a person at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And for the people that are starting their career in software engineering, the greener, the younger people that do want to keep on pushing and being more productive and being a senior and being climbing this ladder at the end of the day, what kind of general advice would you have for them, considering that they've basically just dove into it?
Yeah, I think I believe there's a little bit right now of an overemphasis on technical skills, but I get it, because I think you need the technical skills in order to get a job. Obviously, if you can't prove that a particular tech stack, then it's going to be hard to get hired. But I think that's important, but I also recommend people need to think about soft skills. They need to see the value of building relationships. If you're early in your career, building relationships is really important. It's important even later in your career. And that means talking to people, finding ways to network, working with people that you work side by side with every day. And that takes the form of, asking questions and going out of your way, being proactive to really work with people and understand kind of their perspective on things. So relationship building is important early in your career. I think another piece of advice I'd give you too is think about your career. It's hard. It's easy to get focused on the technology stuff, because that's what you do on a daily basis, and you got to do that. But think about your career. Where do you want to go? Do you want to be, like you said, an individual contributor, or do you want to be a manager? Think about the type of company you want to work for. There's a lot of different, companies out there, and software developers are in demand. They're going to be in demand for a long time. You have options. Think about the type of company you want to work for. Those types of things. And that's important early in your career, because you may have been fortunate and you landed in a company that's perfect for you, and you're going to be there for a long time. That's awesome if that happens. But there's also a chance that maybe this isn't the right fit for you, that at some point you're not growing anymore. You need to be kind of prepared to figure out what your next step is. So my advice, I think, would be, don't let the technology take over. It's important. It's your trade. You got to get good at it, but don't let that be your primary focus or your only focus. It probably needs to be your primary, but it shouldn't be your only focus. And spend time building your other skill sets and thinking about where your career needs to go.
That's amazing. Honestly, I really enjoyed hearing all of your advices and anecdotes, and really just how, it all sounds relatable at the end of the day. So that's super, super fun to just even hear to begin with. But yeah, where can people find more of your stuff?
Yeah, the big thing is 7samurai.dev, and it's not spelled out seven. It's the number seven. There's a movie called Seven Samurai, created back in the '60s, and what I loved about it, it's a story about a group of samurai that came together to help defend a village. And what I loved about it is it's different, a lot of different samurai with different personality, skill sets, things like that. So I kind of named it after that. We'll see how long I can get away with that. But check out 7samurai.dev. That's my site. I do, like you mentioned, I do plan to start putting out a podcast of my own in January, and that'll also be launched on that site as well. And then you'll be able to listen to that on all the different platforms, podcast platforms. So feel free. Also from there, you can check out my LinkedIn profile. I'm on Twitter. I'd love to have discussions. Please, if you want to talk about any of this, I would love a direct message. Just follow me and I'll follow you back, and we can chat about some of this stuff. I do really enjoy talking to developers who are just starting out and just kind of, like I mentioned, hearing their experiences. So don't hesitate to reach out and ask me questions, and I'll probably ask you some.
That's so awesome. Hey, man, Mark, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Oh, it was great. I had a really fun time, and I really appreciate everything you're doing, Perry. You have a great thing going here, and keep on going with it. I really enjoy what you're doing.
Oh, stop it. All right. Really enjoyed that. Anyways, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Take care.